It's a quality of change that is really based on a conscious, nonlinear, non-local approach to transformations that is based on our inherent oneness, and that it recognizes that we are entangled through language, through meaning, through shared context. So it's nothing like very complex. It's just saying like we are all one, and many indigenous worldviews and wisdom traditions have been saying that for a long time. But what fascinates me is that physics itself is telling us that reality is not what it seems. And that means also that social reality is not what it seems.
Hello and welcome to Stories Lived, Stories Told, a dialogue-driven podcast exploring how to create better social worlds through better communication. I'm Abbie, and today I invite you to join me in conversation with Karen O'Brien as we take a communication perspective on quantum social change. To take a communication perspective is to consider what we are making and how we are making it through our communication practices. It means seeing ourselves as active participants with choices about how we show up to each other. It is paying attention to patterns, context, stories, and relationships to better understand how meaning gets made. It is embodying curiosity, mindfulness, collaboration, and dialogue to co-create better social worlds. So whether the topic of today's conversation is familiar to you or not, the hope is that by looking at communication instead of through it, in this conversation and in all that we do, we expand our collective imagination through both storytelling and story hearing, revealing new ways of seeing and being for all of us. At the top of the episode, you heard our conversation partner today, Karen O'Brien. She is the author of You Matter More Than You Think and hosts the Quantum Social Change Substack, among many other things. You will hear more from her by means of introducing herself in just a moment. The question I would have you keep in mind as you listen to this conversation today is what if? This conversation focuses on possibilities and framing and change and how we actually make change happen, and how we might be underestimating ourselves in terms of our capacity for social change. So my hope for this conversation is that it is expansive and emergent and inspires something for you in terms of continuing to always be looking through a lens of inquiry of what if. I talk a lot about stories and possibilities and imagination, and all of that's going to come up in this conversation through the very important and I think very helpful lens of quantum social change. So I'm excited for us to learn about that today from Karen. So let's jump right in. Hi, Karen. Thanks so much for joining me for this conversation today.
Thanks for inviting me, Abby. I'm really happy to be here.
I'm really excited to be speaking with you, and I'll just dive right in. This question that I always like to answer for myself so that I have a moment to reflect. Maybe there's some selfish intentions behind this question I like to start off with so that I can give myself an opportunity to land in this conversation and to give it to you as well. Maybe listeners think about their own answer to this question as they join our conversation. The question of arrival and what are we bringing with us into this conversation? And two things come to mind that I would really love to share with you as we enter into this conversation. The first is kind of my immediate context is that I have just come from one of our CMM Institute webinars, which we've started doing monthly. And I normally try not to schedule things like a webinar and a podcast on the same day. I just generally like to give myself space to, prepare and kind of conserve my energy and give it to kind of one or the other. But this event happened to needed to be rescheduled. And so it just happens, here we are today. And I'm finding that I should give myself a little pat on the back, maybe a little more credit than I have in the past about how much energy I have for these kind of things, because I'm feeling in a really good spot today, having just come from this virtual event. I feel very energized. I don't feel depleted, in a way that I think I maybe have expected I would in the past, because I do value the presence that I bring to those events and the podcast conversations as well. And so I'm kind of riding the high of a really wonderful gathering that I just got to do, ended 30 minutes ago. And here we are, and I'm carrying that energy into our time together. And just what's front of my mind, I think, from this gathering I was just in is We were talking about, we had a wonderful facilitator, Conjit Farrell, who was talking about CMM and creating a therapy toolbox, kind of the way that practices from CMM can be applied in specific contexts of therapy. And I was just struck by how real everything we were talking about felt and how important that feels, that real people in their everyday lives, in their real relationships, have language and have these concepts to be able to better navigate what are admittedly incredibly complex relationships and incredibly complex social worlds, and how truly transformative that can be. It seems so small to zoom super in on the interpersonal communication, the turn by turn. We're talking about bifurcation points and critical moments. And we watched this clip and said, kind of what's going on here. And it can feel so small, but I think it is so big. So that's something that's on my mind. And I think that that plays well into what I'm hoping we'll talk about today. The other thing I'd love to share is a bit of larger piece of context is that I first heard your name in 2024 at the Relating Systems Thinking and Design Conference in Oslo. A number of people were referencing your book, You Matter More Than You Think, and your ideas around quantum social change. And so I just want to share that to say, in my mind, this has been a long time coming, that I've kept you in my peripheral vision, in terms of what you've been up to recently and how all of the incredible work and language that you're offering through your Substack and through your book and through Sea Change, everything that you kind of have your hand in is, again, going back to that word of like transformative and how it relates to my world of things. I think there's a really important overlap for us to explore. So that's what I'm starting with today. Again, a lot of energy and excitement is what I am bringing to you. That is my offering for this hour. So Karen, I wonder how you are arriving. Who are you bringing with you, if anything?
Thanks. No, I feel your energy. And I think that what I'm bringing is this possibility and potential. Because, like you, I've had just some really great conversations in the past few days about transformation, about social tipping points, about agency. And I feel like we are in the middle of a paradigm shift, and it's so exciting. And yet, looking at the news and everything, it's also very frightening because the outcomes aren't certain and we don't know, but I feel that there's a shift going on in society that where people are really waking up to this, the power that we have. And so, yeah, I'd love to talk about that. But I'm in Uppsala, Sweden, where I'm a visiting professor of climate change leadership, and yeah, and I just think it's the message I'm getting from so many people is now is the time.
Yeah.
And so there, that kind of the what you're feeling and that energy and that and the importance of language and communication comes out for me really clearly right now. It is like meaning and mattering.
Yeah, that's a great starting place for us, I think, as an intersection between our work. And I wonder about how you would kind of tell the story or describe how you got where you are, like the work that you're doing. Again, the words I'm hoping we can unpack a little bit today is quantum social change, which are the words I am associating with you based on what I know of your work. So happy for you to say, it's not really that, or here's what it means, or here's all the other things it leads to. I'm open to this conversation going where it does. But I wonder if we could start with you for a second and hear, like, what is the story of you and this work?
Yeah, it has quite a long history, and it really is an ongoing inquiry. And it starts with like more than 3 decades of research on climate change from the social and human dimensions perspectives. And what is it? Climate change impacts, vulnerability, adaptation, the implications for human security, and really like digging deep into all of these like large scale systems change. And when one recognizes what the implications are, then it becomes clear that we need transformation. And then it becomes clear that like transformations can't just be out there in systems, but they have to be also like within us, including in the way we make meaning, including the way that we think of ourselves in relation to the world. And so when I came across some of the work that was being done, for example, by political scientist Alexander Wendt on quantum international relations, I got really interested because challenging the paradigm is considered a high leverage point. Transcending paradigms is an even higher one. So that's, being able to look at paradigms rather than through them is key. And so I started to just think, what does this actually mean for climate change? What are the implications of this if we take this into social change and think differently about transformations. And so maybe that was about 15 years ago. And since then, I've really been just fascinated by what are we missing when we're just taking things from a very reductionist, atomistic, deterministic
Mm.
perspective without seeing the possibilities that exist for other ways of being and relating and, um, yeah, creating the world.
What was if you can maybe distill it to a moment or maybe a series of moments, I won't limit you to just one. What maybe like interested you or inspired you to really dive into this kind of work about what you were seeing, or you've named a name already of people who were influencing you, but what was going on in your own life that maybe aligned with sending you down this trajectory?
Yeah, it's a great question. I think that it was very much that, like, I was focusing on climate change, but really interested in the change part of change. So I had this,
Mm,
like, a side interest and I was reading Donna Zohar's Quantum Self and Quantum Society
yeah.
and books like that, but I didn't actually bring them together with my own work until I took a field course on integral sustainability in El
Mm,
Salvador, and really realized the importance of bringing in the inner dimensions and the outer dimensions, the subjective and the objective together as one, and then starting to say, like, wow, I need to do that in my work too. And then it started to just open up different questions and different ways of approaching my work. And then suddenly all these things were, like, whoa, this is here. Oh, and when I saw then that there were people working on new materialism and agential realism and participatory realism, quantum social science. And then I thought, wow, this is, it's almost like discovering that there's a whole field. And often I find that when I discover, I think, oh, here's something new. And then you go, oh, this goes back to William James in the 1880s or
yeah,
things.
yeah,
So
yeah.
it's just to kind of see, like, oh, to be part of a conversation that I didn't know existed was
Hmm.
really interesting. And it really raised different questions about climate change, about transformations that then I'm still investigating. And I'm really interested in then how do we put this into practice? How do we create real change in the world based on these ideas? And so that's where I'm at now. And that's one of the
Hmm.
reasons I'm writing a newsletter and things, to really just keep challenging myself to, like, what does this mean in practice?
Yes, and great to note that even though some of these conversations may already have been being had in different circles, it's still maybe new to us or will continue to be new to other people. And so it's great to not take for granted that we all share that same understanding or framework. So, in that vein, I'm wondering how you would, now that you've kind of introduced yourself a little bit in your story, how would you introduce quantum social change? And I understand that that's a trickier, easier said than done question. And so I wonder about how we can keep the complexity of what this is and what your work is, while also trying to make it understandable for people in this,
Yeah.
brief hour of a podcast we have together.
Yeah, exactly. And I think it really is, it's a quality of change that is really based on it's a conscious, nonlinear, non-local approach to transformations that is based on our inherent oneness, and that it recognizes that we are entangled through language, through meaning, through shared context. So it's nothing like very complex. It's just saying, like, we are all one, and many indigenous worldviews and
Mm-hmm.
wisdom traditions have been saying that for a long time. But what fascinates me is that physics itself is telling us that reality is not what it seems. And that means
Mm-hmm.
also that social reality is not what it seems. So it really isn't that complicated, but it is like that like, if we go beyond this dualistic and binary us other humans nature subject object way of approaching the world and see ourselves as one, that the individual change, collective change, and systems change then become one. And so what I do and what you do, we are entangled through and language comes in and
Mm-hmm.
communications comes in, but also just our way of being, our way of showing up, correlated, through and in many ways just that entanglement. And to me, it's I think the quantum word throws people because then they go, oh, quantum physics, nobody understands that.
Yes.
But I think to get to the essence of it is that's the whole point, is that we don't understand it. And there's many
Mm,
interpretations, but a lot of the interpretations are very much about like that we live in a participatory universe, that we are co-creating the world in every moment, and that we're not just passive like the billiard balls
yeah.
like that we're Einstein, like we're just bumping around as
Yeah.
things in space, but that we're actually creating the world as we're we are
Hmm.
participating in it. And so it's really not complicated, and but it also opens up a lot of this idea that we matter more than we think. And when I say
Yes.
we matter more than we think, it's not just being significant and important, but it's substance. It is we are
Yeah.
collapsing a potential with every decision, with every action, with our
Mm.
thoughts, with our every conversation opens a possibility or shuts down possibilities.
This is good that my assumptions are already being challenged because I think that I was going straight to, well, this is complex for the reason you've just described, that I hear quantum physics or quantum, and there's a little bit of glazing over that happens. I think anyone that's watched like a Marvel movie, for example, and they're talking about quantum leaps and metaverses and, all of these incredibly expansive concepts that people may or may not fully understand. There is a sense of complexity, or I guess, yeah, a better word is, I already used an assumption of complexity because it's different, it's other, it's not interwoven into our most basic understandings, or competencies or language that we're using. And so I'm wondering what, yeah, to follow this thread of it's quite simple, but also to get into the idea that meaning is multiple, like we're constructing meaning. And so I want to keep following this train of not living out my assumptions, but like checking myself and checking this conversation. I'm curious about what you mean when or what it looks like for us to have an inherent oneness as you've described. What does that actually mean in our lives?
Yeah. Well, I think that oneness is, when we saw the photos from Artemis to come back of the
Hmm.
Earth, and we get this, oh my gosh, we're all on one planet. And then we
Yeah.
say, oh, but we're also connected to space, we're connected to the universe, we can go out and out and out. And that oneness really is that it's, that like it is a shift in perspective, because we have an
Hmm.
experience as an individual. And it's not just to say we're only one, but we are individuals and collectives at the same time. So we
Mm.
can perceive ourselves as I have a body, I have some, opinions and all this stuff. And then to recognize that this is not separate from the whole. So it gets into that both and it's really the ability to hold that paradox that, like, okay, I have my, my life here and everything, and it is connected to everyone else's. So what I'm doing now actually does affect other people. It's affecting the systems. It's like that, like in a very like causal way in terms of
Hmm.
climate change and things, but also in an acausal way, that I'm part of a larger conversation. I'm part of these, resonances of, affect and emotions that are going around. So I don't have to directly affect somebody on the other side of the world with an idea, but we see that they're popping up, that there is something going on in this. And that's what I mean when we talk about non-local change. It means
Hmm.
that I didn't actually affect you or you affect me, but we're part of a larger conversation that's going on
Mm.
this planet right now. And to me, that is really, it's exciting, because it means that like that we all matter, that we're all adding to the conversation, we're all shifting systems. And I use the concept of fractals very much, of like we're really shifting patterns on this planet right now. And
Mm.
so if we think in terms of like how do we change our own patterns, change societal patterns, then we start to see that that social change isn't so different. It's repatterning the world.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, the language of patterns really resonates with me as a practitioner of CMM because, and maybe it's CMM-ish language I don't talk about as much as I should, because really the whole of it is about patterns, communication practices, and communication patterns. Because if you, again, I already described it as, in so many ways, it feels like a intense zooming in, because that interpersonal communication level of our world feels like one of the most basic ones. But if you zoom out on your zooming in, then you will be able to see that there are patterns happening. And one of the most useful concepts, I think, from CMM is this idea of unwanted repetitive patterns, or URPs. Other people just call them ERPs. So, pick your poison of however you'd want to refer to them. But I love that idea for how it helps us name that we are always creating something. We're always participating in patterns. And sometimes we end up somewhere we didn't mean to. And so we have control in some ways. We have power, we have agency, we have choices about how we're showing up and how we're communicating. And always we might find ourselves in unwanted repetitive patterns because we matter and other things matter. And so it's not only our will that we're exerting onto other people in our communication in the world, but we're part of small and large patterns that we have choices about how we interact into. So then I guess for me, the crux of that is, again, do you have the zoomed out perspective to see yourself as part of patterns? And do you have the tools to see yourself as having choices, I guess, in how you act into those patterns?
Exactly. And that's really about, we're socialized into so much for, every cultural norms and social norms, and almost indoctrinated into a way of being on autopilot. And when we suddenly start to question the given, then we become like self-authoring, and then and that sense of that kind of agency can also be very destructive when we separate from the social patterns. So when we get to then the point where we recognize that, oh, here I am being an individual agent of change, challenging society, then when we can get that reflexivity and have that self-transforming mind, as Robert Keegan puts it, then we suddenly start to realize, oh, I have a choice. I can be this way or that way. And if I do this, then these relations work better. If I do this, then this doesn't. And so values come in and ethics come in. And really it's about then that quality of agency emerges as an important factor. And that to me is the essence then of quantum social change. It's how do I show up? What is the quality of my agency, recognizing that individual agency, collective agency, political agency, all of these are related. So it really makes us not just these trivial individuals who need to be changed in the name of something, but it gives us this responsibility or the ability to respond to whatever is happening in the world based on values that apply to the whole. And then suddenly there you're getting integrity and possibility.
Yes, that's such a great point. And as you're talking, it makes me think of a question I think I've probably asked other people on this podcast, certainly a general wondering in my life. And now hearing what you're saying, I'm thinking you might have an interesting perspective on this, that because so much of, I guess maybe let me start in a different way, acknowledging that a lot of people talk about social construction. Certain practitioners that I'm working with, like Sheila McNamee, are starting to use relational construction even more so than social construction to really drill down the point that nothing is real alone. Everything is co-create. We all have parts in each other's lives and the shared meaning that we're making. And so I guess there's a dissonance for me in terms of I'm just one individual in a relationally constructed world. And so I can go learn about things like quantum social change. I can go learn about coordinated management of meaning and adopt a communication perspective for myself. I can't make anybody else do that or change. And so how do I navigate this, what feels to me, at least, I won't speak for others, but feels to me like dissonance of I'm just one person in a socially constructed world. And so how do I balance my own individuality and what are the constraints of my physical being, the oneness of me as one individual versus the collective oneness that we all share?
Yeah, I think that's one of the big challenges in there, because we're basically talking about what is the nature of reality.
Yeah.
And so when we
just that little question, just that little
question, which then opens up to mystery. It opens up to questions because again, the quantum physics has so many different interpretations of the observer collapses the wave function into a particular
Mhm.
occurrence of something. And so that idea then that like we feel as individuals, we feel like the small drop in the ocean without actually seeing that we are the water too, that we're
Mhm.
part, like to
Yeah,
see
great
our
point.
role in that isn't it's a perspective shift. And
Mm.
it's something that when we start to like absorb that and embody it, we can see we might not feel it every moment and every day, but it is to recognize then that, okay, if I take this as the reality that I matter in every moment and that my
Mhm.
relations matter and that what I do is not just me individually, but I'm part of a larger whole. And I'm
Yeah.
also affecting that through, whether you call it ripple effects or resonance or
Yeah.
entanglement or whatever, that is also powerful. And that when we have that idea that we are more powerful than we think in terms of principled power of being agents of change, then I think we open up for being just much more grounded in what we do and taking our relationships serious, but also as like taking our language seriously and
Mhm.
our listening seriously. And okay, how am I going to show up in a tense situation, in a conflict, and will I repeat the pattern of us versus other?
Mhm.
And I find that I think is very challenging, because there's a lot of
Yeah.
times where you look at people and you go like, oh, who are these people? And they go, oh, they are me too. And like that, the whole, and psychology
Yep.
and like neurosciences, it's all showing with mirror neurons and things that we're wired for connection in our brains, and but it's socialized to be very much like um, we want to be individuals and we want to be
Yeah.
part of the group and all that, but that's almost like to be able to hold the both and again, that I am an
Yeah.
individual and I'm a collective
Yeah.
in this experience that we're having right now. And whatever the in Buddhism, like it's all a veil of like that we're we're we believe ourselves to be individuals. But
Mm.
where I come from, being with a concern about climate change, there is a physical reality that I'm concerned about, and ice melts at
Yeah.
certain temperatures, and sea levels will rise, and people will be affected by it. And so, how do we create a world that works for everyone, including all other species and non-humans, and also future generations? So to be able to
Mhm.
have that circle of care that just extends as wide as possible, that
Yeah.
really is a muscle then I think that we need to practice, to be able to say this is not just about me, and it's not just about we, but it's about the whole. And that really brings the question of integrity or oneness into account. Like
Mhm.
how do I act with integrity on behalf of myself and all?
Yes, that's such a great point. And the thing that's coming up for me as you're speaking is just to go back and clarify like what it means to you to use the descriptor, I guess, adjective, maybe in this case of like quantum to social change. You're distinguishing. You're not just talking about social change, you're talking about quantum social change. So I wonder what that means to you, because part of what's coming to my mind thinking about something like a quantum leap in my layperson's terms, I'm thinking about a big leap and large transformation or a lot of progress. And so for me, something that's coming up as we're talking about quantum social change is a kind of largeness, I guess, or a maybe a different way to say it is like an impactfulness, because I love what you said that we are the drop and we are the ocean. And so I think sometimes we get really stuck on, I'm just one drop. How can anything that I be doing matter at all, like make any kind of significant impact in such a large world, social world? And so I think something I at least take away, and I'd be curious your perspective on what you mean when you talk about quantum social change, is that there's a little bit of a reminder or a shift in no, you that it's that's the matter, that's the you matter more than you think message, I guess, to say no, change is happening right now and you can be helping to make change happen right now. It doesn't just have to be this centuries, decades, whatever from now, people
Sure.
will hopefully feel the effects of the things we're doing today. That's one timeline. I think there are many things that are happening at that rate. And also, how are things happening right this second? Because, like you're saying, in the context of climate change, we don't really have centuries and decades to wait. And so it really is a question of what is changing? What are we changing in this moment?
Yeah, and there's a lot in there because a quanta is the smallest measurable, and we're talking about like subatomic particles, and
Huh.
the smallest one you can measure is a quanta. So we're talking about small changes making
Mm,
a big difference on the
yes.
one level, but also, quantum physics is relevant at the subatomic level and also at the like, black holes and
Got it. Yeah.
the huge level. But what we also then we think, oh, there's then this world that is classical where we can use classical physics and say, like Newtonian physics of motion and prediction and things, but that's an exception to it. We live in a quantum world, and
Mm,
then there in our other world, in our the lived world we experience, where if I drop a glass it will break. It is there, that quantum world. It's, there's just too much information that all like
mm,
fuzzes out and everything. So we get the classical exception. And so if we start to think in terms of, like the metaphors of quantum physics, entanglement, superposition, all things being possible at one point, or things are quantum tunneling, there's a lot of different way the language is for a whole different model of physics, and those are useful, but also the methods of quantum physics have been
hmm.
useful in like quantum decision making, quantum game theory, and even language cue methodology for understanding like how we make meaning of, how shared meaning emerges through subjectivity, all of that. But I think what we're talking about here is also the meaning of quantum physics opens up then the question marks. It raises that, that like one of the interpretations is quantum Bayesianism or cubism, that our bets on the future are actually creating that future. And I see that
Mm.
very much with climate change. The minute we just say game over, then it
Yes.
doesn't mean just game over. It means we stop investing in renewable energies, in plant-based diets. We start to just say, let's adapt to a 2 degree Celsius warmer world or 3 degrees Celsius warmer world, or it has its own impact. So when that goes into why our beliefs matter, and
Hmm.
that it's not just like the beliefs that we know we have, but we have to be able to look at our beliefs rather than through them. And it goes into that self-reflexivity, like, what am I believing and why? If
Hmm.
I believe that we can't make a difference and I don't matter, well, then guess what? I probably won't matter. Like I'm not going to
Hmm.
take any actions that are going to work on, and, whatever my sphere of influence, whether it's my family and what we eat for dinner, or my community and how we organize, a space, whether it's going to be a park or a parking lot,
Yes.
and my city, my job, all of these things are very much the decisions that matter for us,
Yeah.
and that where we can actually take that role. And then we don't see that there are many, this is happening everywhere. And so that, I think, is the going back to that, are we underestimating our collective capacity for social change? And
Yeah.
putting quantum in front of social change shifts the quality of those interactions and the relationships, because social change often is like the one who then gets the change, they become the ones in power, and then they become the oppressors and the others are
Mhm.
out. And it's always us versus others. And Paulo Freire made that clear in his pedagogy of the oppressed, with like that, the well-adapted individual suits the oppressor's needs, and that
Mm.
the ones who then become, are like transcend that and become powerful, they often just become, they're repeating that same pattern.
Yeah.
So
Right.
through conscientization, we start to become aware of what we're not aware of, and that's what, he talks
Hmm.
about consciousness of consciousness. That we start to
Yes.
see that, oh, we have choices, we can make these, and to be able to
Mm.
stop in the moment and say, oh, I can actually stop this pattern right here, right now.
Yeah.
And I think that that's where, when it goes into like structures of the world and agency, we think, we've thought of structures as being these very firm things, like, this is the Constitution, this is the way
Hmm.
things are. We can't move, change these. And what, like Alexander Wentz quantum social theory says, that these are just patterns that have been stabilized through action, 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 and
Yes.
our beliefs and things. And what we see, what's happening now in the world, is a lot of these structures that we thought were so, strong and, supportive,
Yeah.
are just, they're only as good as our social and cultural norms, and as good as our ethics, and as good as what
Hmm.
our commitments are to the well-being of everybody. We can just, we can destroy structures very slowly, but then how do we build structures? And that means that we need to collectively actually come up with patterns that are going to work for a long time, that we can stabilize
Mm.
for, to be resilient in the face of change, because change is happening, not just with climate change, but with artificial intelligence, biodiversity loss. There's all sorts of things that and people talk about it as the poly crisis or the meta crisis.
Yes.
And that's where I think in the work I do on transformative change and quantum social change is, if we get to the root of the issue, down to the paradigms, down to transcending the paradigms, then we will be addressing all these problems, because we wouldn't let children go to bed hungry. We wouldn't let just be destroying nature just for short-term individual material gains. We would be challenging ourselves in every moment and saying, what can we do differently? And we are
Mhm.
creative as humans, and we
Yeah.
can work together with so many different perspectives and worldviews on the planet, that the possibility and potential for a different future exists right here and right now, instead of pushing it off in the future with another vision for 2030 or 2050 or
Mhm.
2100 and
Mhm.
goals and things like that. It's like, how do we bring the future we want right here, right now? And that goes back into like the physics of space, time, and matter. That it's like,
Yeah.
at the end of the day, does time exist? Quantum physics will tell us that it can go back, time can go backwards, and all these things that just don't, sit with our heads. It's like, I
Yes.
know that I'm a day older than I was yesterday, and but then then you have many indigenous cultures who talk about circular time, or
Yeah.
time starting forward and moving backwards and things. So it's really
Mm.
the perspective that we've collectively adopted, and I think just raising questions, and that's where,
Mhm.
to me, quantum social change is an ongoing inquiry of just asking, what if we
Yeah.
have it
Yeah.
wrong? What if, rather, so that
Mm.
in 30, 40 years, people don't look back and go, oh my God, couldn't they see in 2026 that they were entangled, they had all this possibility and
Yes.
potential? If they changed the way they
Mm.
related and communicated, they could have,
Mm.
it would have been so easy. And I think we owe it to the future and the past to actually open our minds rather than shut them down
Mm.
right now.
Hey, it's Abbie here, taking a pause in this conversation to invite you to reflect with me about how this episode is hitting you so far. If you're wanting to learn more about the coordinated management of meaning theory that I reference in this conversation, I'd recommend checking out the CMM Institute Substack for additional educational resources. If you're loving what you're hearing and are curious to learn more about CMM in different contexts, use the link in the show notes to follow the CMM Institute event page, where you can stay up to date with our monthly webinars hosted by yours truly. These events are an opportunity to gather with our community and explore CMM in different ways. And if you're looking to be even more connected, you can peruse our other CMM Institute initiatives, like our free social emotional learning resources, Cosmo Activities, which feature ways to engage all ages in conversations about building better social worlds. Links to all of these can be found in the show notes. As we turn toward the second half of this episode, I invite you to reconnect with your body and your environment. As the music plays to take us back to the conversation, take a breath, sink into your body wherever you are, take in your surroundings, and settle in for some more stories. Let's get back into it. That is such a beautiful way of saying things. And I'm really glad you're bringing it back to this perspective level, because that's helping me kind of understand why I think I'm tempted to say, oh, this is complex. I'm projecting is what's going on, because the coordinated management of meaning theory has been criticized for being complex. And my response to that has mostly been, well, it has to be to say anything real and true about complex communication processes, complex relationships, complex social worlds. And at the same time, that conversation of complexity is maybe not as helpful in this moment, because what I'm realizing, a distinction I want to make, is that outside of talking about complexity, what I think I'm talking about is depth or breadth, in terms of, in my own world, the comparison I can make is I see a lot of people talking about communication skills, like, I don't know if you ever spend any time on LinkedIn, but I'm getting a lot of posts about some bullet pointed list of just do this and then you're a good communicator. And that just like breaks my heart because sure, those can work to certain extents in different contexts, but what is really needed is a communication perspective, which is deeper than just communication skills. And I think that that's like, in many ways, I haven't thought of a more eloquent way to say this, but it's like that's the thing under the thing in a lot of, or the thing before the thing. You know, like we're taking for granted that people see themselves as active participants in co-constructing meaning through communication, and then that having, you know, an effect on their social worlds. And so if you take that for granted, if people don't see themselves as that, you can give them all the communication skills you want, but they don't have the perspective to back it up to be able to then like, you know, put those skills into the world. Yeah, I'm trying to use deeper, I think, instead of more complex, because I don't want the label of complex to be like a turnoff for people, but it's a depth, there's a depth to having a communication perspective versus just communication skills. Because if you go for communication skills without the communication perspective, then you're assuming that people have this understanding that they have the choices and the choices have impacts and the you know, like on and on and on in terms of social change and what you have the power to do relationally. And so I just think it's something that really can't be taken for granted. And again, I'll note that again, I'm probably projecting here because this is me going back to like my younger self. And it was mind blowing when I encountered social construction and CMM, because I did not have a sense of myself as a meaning maker in the world with choices. It was very much a lens of there's right, there's wrong. Capital T truth is somewhere out there to be discovered rather than many truths, little t truths or stories coexist and we make them together. And it's a very different perspective. And so I think, like you're saying, if we have the perspective that things are what they are, then that is the reality because we believe it to be the reality. And so we go, nothing's going to happen right now. We can't do anything right now. If we have the perspective that we have choices, things really change, I think.
Yeah, no, you're absolutely right. And I think that that's part of adult development, like being able to like what, you know, like what has us, which, you know, we can't see ourselves as separate from it, to actually be able to see like, oh, look at it as an object and go, oh, here I am doing this again. And, you know, and
Yes.
reflecting on that and then being, you know, being able to always, because when it has us, then
Yeah.
we're very much trapped in it versus when we can actually see it from a perspective. And I think that that is very important when, as you were saying, a lot of people are putting down the list. We're working so much on the practical sphere, on technical and behavioral changes and things that we tend to be very good at, but they aren't very, you know, we're not very, they don't create the systems changes. We
Mm-hmm.
need to look in the political sphere of the systems and the structures and the rules and social
Right.
norms and things and how we organize society and power and politics and interests and all that. But we get stuck there too because we don't look at the perspectives, the personal sphere of our individual and shared beliefs, values, and worldviews. So
Mm-hmm.
I work with these three spheres of transformation, and it doesn't come down to then just putting people in the practical sphere and saying you need to change your perspective, but it is about awakening that subjectivity and that sense of like, you know, making people the subjects of change in their lives rather than the objects to be changed on behalf of whatever climate
Mm-hmm.
change or whatever
Yes.
the issue of the day is. And that is so powerful then when we start to realize, but it's also this process because we always have to, you know, this self-reflexive critical thinking, we always have to be able to check ourselves on, you know, and what am I missing, what is, you know, and that's where grounding it in values becomes really important.
Mm-hmm.
Like if I hold myself to values that apply to the whole, like equity and justice and compassion and
Mm-hmm.
integrity and things, then, you know, it's almost like that it's a way to in Monica Sharma's work on radical transformational leadership, she refers to it as an acausal space of oneness, because it's we're trying to put words on that place where we are entangled through, you know, like
Mm-hmm.
it is that it's really hard to find the words to put that because we live in a very binary world, so that it just becomes then too woo woo. But we know that that scientists, you know, like that we are like our brains are wired to connect, our hearts are wired to
Mm-hmm.
connect energetically. So adds a lot to the not just to the like the complexity, but to the possibility. Because what looks
Yeah.
complex to us right now, it could be look very simple in 5 years or 2 years or something.
Yeah.
Like, of course that. It's just that we
That's a
don't
great
have the
point.
mental frameworks to make sense of it. So we're a little bit like trying to retrofit it onto everything else we
Hmm.
know. But then, and I see that with like younger students who are coming in now, and there's like, oh, they understand this so much more than I ever did.
Interesting.
This like they're because people are growing up in a more complex world too, with
Hmm.
interconnections and with a different language of, the whole language of the internet, the language of social
Yes.
media and things that they get that. So they know the vibe and they can talk
Yes.
about that. And then it's like, oh yeah, that's kind of what we're talking about in that
Mm.
acausal space of oneness. So yeah, so it's I don't think it's like yeah, sometimes we hide under complexity, and then we fear like
Yeah.
simplicity,
Yes.
as but rather that we should be focusing like not on making it just like simplistic and overly like forgetting the important
Yeah.
variables and factors, but just to make it, and that's where again language comes in because the metaphors we use really create the reality that we're experiencing,
Oh my
and
gosh. Yeah.
so yeah, so how do we use our language to be more connected?
Yes, I am so appreciative of you making that connection between like you and your students and how you're relating to these concepts, because an idea that's just a kind of curiosity I've had in my head about some of my own experience, just in a kind of maybe passive, like, I wonder what that means or what that makes, is that what you're saying has made me think of, there's a author and a podcaster I really like named Glennon Doyle. She has a podcast called We Can Do Hard Things. And in her book, in a lot of her life, she talks about experiencing addiction and experiencing disordered eating throughout her life, and how she's come to I think, some really healthy places and some really helpful frameworks. And so she's kind of named this story, which I think a lot of her listeners probably that are her age have more a similar story of, you go through this much of life without knowing these things, and then you know these things and continue to learn things, and things look different. But I'm in a different spot because I'm 20 to 30 years younger than she is. I don't know exactly how old she is. And I'm like, oh, but I'm listening to your podcast. I'm finding value and I have these ideas now. So how is it different to be a 20 something with these ideas and then live the rest of your life that way? The third kind of point that I want to add to this spectrum is that one of our initiatives within the CMM Institute is, we call them Cosmo Activities. And there we could describe them in a lot of different ways: relational stewardship, communication, competency, social emotional learning tools that don't talk about CMM super explicitly, but are about a CMM-ish way of being for kids of different ages. And the idea behind it is, if children that are as young as 4 years old start having these conversations, because all the research we've done shows they can have these conversations in an age appropriate way, what kind of adults will they grow into? And I think it's kind of a beautiful thing to think about. Yeah, how is the learning getting younger and younger in a way? And what kind of different adults can each of these generations be if we make the effort? And that maybe there's like a piece of like urgency there, just like collective valuing, like you are kind of alluding to earlier. If we all say this is important for these current children to have, so that they become these kind of adults that have greater tools to navigate complexity and greater tools to create social change and to see themselves as people that can do that, then that is transformative, I feel like. And I don't know if that, yeah, I guess I'll just stop there. I have a lot of thoughts going in my
Yeah,
head.
no, I think that's spot on. And so you imagine like if you're a baby and your parents read to you quantum physics for babies, and
Yeah.
then you start to realize like from the very
Mhm.
start, okay,
Mhm.
entanglement is the nature, and then you would know, you wouldn't
Yeah.
have to be having like all these fits. You just like, okay, I'm going to communicate to in a
Yeah.
different way. Not that there's a whole like developmental thing, but I just think the
Yes.
point you're making is really that, and that is part of the evolutionary process. And what concerns me, given
Mhm.
like climate change and how little time we have, is that many people are in decision making power, they have never
Mhm.
learned like like had a formal, systems thinking, ecology, climatology, or things. So you end up just having this, I believe in this, or I don't believe in that. There's truth that, like the black and
Hmm.
white world, without being able to see that, like, so that education that we need has to be for young people and like
Yeah.
the more seniors in this.
Right.
And I think that is like, how do we get a cultural conversation going? And that to me is part of the paradigm shift that needs to go on. So like reverse mentoring and
Hmm.
and learning from, and I think we're all seeing that now with like computer technologies and things that there's, the digital natives versus the
Hmm.
ones who are like, whoa, I
Right.
remember the
Right.
telephone and copy machine and things like that. And it's like,
Yes.
so how do we, like keep up with the possibilities that exist? So
Yeah. And to
yeah.
acknowledge it as like by design almost that, if, situate yourself however you want. If you, however old you are talking to someone who's maybe a younger generation than you, and you're describing, I'm picturing like an aha moment. Again, thinking about myself of like, it was an aha moment to be like, meaning is socially constructed and I'm a part of that. But if a younger generation is going, well, yeah, duh, then like that's a good, even though there maybe feels like a
Yeah.
disconnect, that's a good thing that they've learned
Mhm.
it earlier than we learned it, and on and on and on. Yeah.
That goes into like, how do you like to be the path breakers, to creating those
Yes.
paths for others. And that was where,
Mm.
like the quantum physicists, but then many of the quantum physicists were also looking at Eastern religions and things, and looking at the
Yeah.
path that has been laid out for, millennia.
Huh.
So how do, that they then, and then we're just kind of, that's where we're at right now, is like we can go this way or we can go this way. And so we
Yeah.
need more people to then to pave that way. And then the other generations like, duh, yeah, this is, we take this for
Yeah.
granted, and then they have that capacity and possibility to take, put things together in a different way. So
Hmm.
so when I talk about like, oh, we need to connect the dots and then reconnect the dots and everything, but they're like already in a different world and connecting
Yes.
different, like connecting dots that I don't even see. So
Yeah.
so and that's so important
Yeah.
too. And but also that we like ground it also in wisdom, though, that it's not just
Hmm.
about what we know, but then
Great
it's like,
point.
okay, how do we keep the ethical, dimensions of this here? And often the wisdom comes through life experience as well. And so we're developing vertically, like in our capacity to
Mm.
make meaning, but we also then have to have like that moral and ethical dimension along the way. Otherwise, we see where we end up with people that may be very smart and see very many, different
Hmm.
possibilities, in space and whatever what we could do. But if it doesn't, if it doesn't benefit the whole, and
Right.
take care of, we can't have a world that works for some and not others.
Yes.
Um, yeah, I mean, we will end up with yeah, a lot of trauma.
Yeah. That's a great point. A quote that's coming back into my mind that I've been thinking about recently, I've used it as a way to frame a proposal I'm putting together for a workshop for RSD, actually, this coming year, where I said I first learned of you in Oslo in 2024. And all of my Googling has just said it's a Chinese proverb. So there's probably someone more specific to attribute it to. And I've seen a couple different versions of it, but the one that I like is theory without practice is foolish. Practice without theory is dangerous. And that feels like that speaks really well to an intersection I think you and I both are trying to exist at, of informed practice and not getting caught up in all the theory realm or all the practice realm, but really trying to marry them together. And so I'm wondering about just trying to again be conscious of the who else is here with us, and that's the listeners, people who are maybe feeling that this is, and I'll admit maybe I'm feeling it in some ways too, this is a really like conceptual conversation, or at least we've thrown around a lot of words that people might need to go Google if they're feeling like they don't quite understand. I'm wondering about how we can fall back on the really great tool of stories to try to help bring this down to a level that makes sense to anyone who's listening. And so I'm wondering if there's a story in your mind. You brought up your students, maybe there's something from your teaching or your consulting, or whatever story that's coming to mind right now for you. I'm wondering how you can help us to really like picture and imagine for ourselves like what an embrace of a better sense of mattering, a better sense of oneness, a better sense of social change and our role in it. Like, how does that how have you seen that transform people and have impacts on things like climate change or other, social change areas?
Yeah, let me think about that. Because I think like the main thing with like quantum physics is like a subatomic particle can be a particle and a wave at the same time. And just to make that clear for people, like if you've ever been in a sports event and doing the wave, you're still an individual, but you're
Yeah,
also
yeah.
part of this wave.
I
So
love
you're
that.
both and when you stand up or sit down
Hmm.
and everything. And if you decide to leave the wave, you're still making an individual choice, but the wave um, is there.
Mm.
And but I think in terms of recognizing that we like both waves and particles, both individuals and collectives, I often have my students like, or now we do it with all of like groups in society, is to just make one small change in your life and
Mm.
do it like we call it the C challenge and do
Mm.
it for 30 days and not because you want to reduce your carbon footprint or do something for sustainability, but just to look at change as an object and then
Mm.
really engage with like, okay, what does it actually mean in terms of my habits and logistics and all the practical things? What does it mean in terms of social and cultural norms? Listening to how are your friends and neighbors responding to this? Are they, is it as you expected or is it not as you expected? And looking at, are the systems in place that I need to succeed with this or not?
Mm.
If I try to stop using plastic, are there alternatives? Can I do this or not? Or are there things on the menu that would be, more plant-based or whatever? So
Mhm.
you become systems aware, you become socially and culturally
Mm.
aware, you become very like practically aware, but you also then we become aware of the assumptions in our head and our beliefs and what we value and things. And so those 30 days day experiments are a really good way of actually looking at patterns in our lives and what happens if I interrupt a pattern for 30 days? What does it do to me? And
Mhm.
often we've done it with, kids in school and 80-year-olds and, and when, the children will be like, oh, I've been reading before bed and they will talk about all the great
Oh.
things. And at the end we ask them like, and are you going to continue? It's like, I don't know. But what it does, what we usually find out, and what
Yeah.
I've found out from experiencing this is once you have actually established the pattern, then you go like, oh, that was actually really nice to read fiction before bed, or
Yes.
oh, it was really nice to go for a walk for half an hour a day or things, or not to buy anything for a month. It's like I don't need
Mhm.
this, and so that is a really good way to start to realize of like what matters and why you matter, because
Mm.
it's not through what you do, but it's through the stories we tell. It's through sharing it with other people. It's through getting, and that's where I think, because why I got very excited about it, because I would remember every story that students told me about it. And I can still remember what their, like what their challenges were and what it meant
Mhm.
to actually, like stop being busy and play the guitar or use
Mm.
plastic twice or do things. So it really is that like we are storied people, and to be
Yeah.
able to tell ourselves a different story about change is really powerful, because then we start to see that it's not just us, but it's the whole system that needs to change. But it happens through conversations, through asking for alternatives, through organizing for alternatives, through fighting for alternatives. Saying like, hey, we actually need bike lanes. We need this, and being able to then show up and shift the conversations, not to be like fight against, but fight
Mhm.
for something on behalf of really put our energy and commitment into saying like, okay, this is something that matters.
Yes. Oh, that feels so big. And the kind of CMM lens I want to add to what you're saying is we talk a lot about communication relationships as like playful and as rehearsal or as practice. And I'm not just thinking about like the way I think we've already been using it. Like, I don't know, if you play a sport, then you would know you go to practice for that sport. If you're, someone who's in a play, you'd go to rehearsal. That there's a little that not a little, I won't even diminish it that way. The whole thing is like trial and error in a way. And I think it's really beautiful, something you've named of you don't have to know the end of the story to start the story, so to speak, in terms of you don't have to start with your goal and then make a change in order to get to that goal. You can make a change and then pay attention to what it does and just let it do what it's going to do. And that seems like, I don't know. I'm going to have to like keep sitting with that, because I think that's really important, especially maybe it's just speaking to me as someone who it's like, I mean, I, live and work and exist in the United States, which is very much a capitalist culture of productivity and efficiency. And so there is a sense of like, oh, if I'm going to try to choose a new kind of like workout or way to move my body, I want to say, okay, well, I want to be stronger and I want to lose weight. So I will do this, rather than what kind of exercise would feel good to me. And then let's see what happens. There's a kind of really different thinking and different world of possibilities, I think, that gets opened up. And I'm probably preaching to the choir here. This is your whole thing. You understand that when you make a change to make a change and then let what happens, that puts you in, I think, a totally different mindset than starting with the change in the goal, because I think some of those feel really far away. Maybe that gets us back to the conversation of climate change, especially. The change feels so intangible and distant. So starting there is maybe not helpful, but starting somewhere else could get us there.
Yeah. Yeah, I think you're right, because like it becomes very linear and deterministic, and this
Exactly.
is the path and the way. Whereas,
Yeah.
like, the future, is Buckminster Fuller, is like live your life as an experiment and
Yeah.
be
Yeah.
open then to seeing what is the next path and the next step. And that is like, if we matter in the moment, then every moment we can just see like, okay, we want more
Yes.
of this, we want this, and like we're moving in a direction that is aligned with our values,
Yeah.
the values that apply to the whole,
Mm-hmm.
and universal values. And we start to see different possibilities. And when we connect with others, we're like, it becomes like a synergistic type of
Yeah.
an experience where more emerges, because when we are in like coherence and resonance with everything, we new things emerge. And that's where
Mm-hmm.
I think the excitement is that we, again, we when in that, if we're just rewarded for being individuals and having our own ideas instead of working
Mm-hmm.
collectively. And in research we talk about co-production, co-design of research, and I think that is, we need that in society too. And that is the heart of democracy. How do we want to
Yes.
organize ourselves so that we, for the benefit not just of ourselves but for all and future generations. And indigenous cultures have been talking
Mm-hmm.
about that, taking into account past and future generations all the time. So it's really like, yeah, I think, when going back to where we were talking about, like, it isn't really that complex. It can actually be like, it could be very fun too. And I think to
Yes.
have that element of like, that there should be joy and fun in creating a world that works for everyone, rather than making it into like we talk about leverage points in this mechanistic
Mm-hmm.
type
Mm-hmm.
way. So so it is this, it really is a shift in the way we
Yeah.
are thinking and being and relating. And I think many people are just ripe and ready for that shift. And I see it
Yes.
happening everywhere, and especially, like in your generation. And it's like, we're, like, we're on it.
Yeah. Yeah. I'm loving this, and I'm thinking about what people can walk away with, and also just, yeah, being aware that we're kind of wrapping up now. I wonder about, of course, there is more to say. There's probably much more to say, but I wonder if I can ask you broadly the question of what else, in terms of what do you want to leave people with? And well, I think you've already left people with a lot of great things. I hope people maybe want to do that 30-day challenge. Pay attention for themselves. What happens if you make one change for 30 days? I hope people think about life as experimentation. I hope people see the beauty and the possibility of entanglement. So with all that in mind, knowing that there's no pressure to add anything else, because I think we've already covered a lot, but what else is there for you to kind of wrap up, to the extent that we
Yeah,
can, this
yeah.
conversation?
Mhm. I think that, like, where I'm going now is really, okay, how do we scale transformative change, and not scaling like top down, bottom up, and global and local, but how do we create like these fractals, these self-similar patterns that repeat?
Mm,
And social, we see fractals in mathematics and in nature and trees and in rivers, all these different leaf patterns and river
yeah.
patterns that are very similar. But in social patterns, social fractals, they are based on, what we all deeply care about for ourselves and others. And they're things that we can see, that like what you do, how you act in your community and how you act for the
Yes.
world has to be like consistent and coherent. And to me, that starting to think about like, how do we scale through patterns, not through and processes and conversations,
Yeah.
rather than as a let's just like scale up, scale out.
Yeah.
Just repeating the patterns that are already existing, rather than just like creating context specific things that are part of that they fit together with everything. And so it goes into that, when it comes down to that, to scaling change, that every one of us matters more than we think. And that is I think that gives a lot of not just hope, but practice. And people are always saying, what does quantum social theory mean in practice? And I think it just means that practice matters.
Yeah.
And so being aware of the way we speak, being aware of the way we act, and recognizing that we're human, we're not perfect, and that but that we are collectively, we can do better.
I think that is a wonderful place to end, and people will hear it in just a second with the outro that I always put on the end of the episodes, but I just feel I need to reaffirm it for you now, that I always like to say, just because the episode ends doesn't mean the conversation does, because I just want to acknowledge there's so much more to say and think, and the practice, the experimentation follows each of us out into our lives, in CMM, where this conversation has an afterlife and it stays with us and it changes and it grows. And so I just thank you for this hour of, I hope for listeners, and certainly for me, really wonderful conversation and just expansion of my mind. I feel like an expansion of possibilities that are coming to mind as we've been talking. So thanks so much, Karen.
Thank you. And I hope we continue the conversation.
Okay, that is all for today's episode. But remember, the conversation doesn't stop just because the episode does. There are so many ways to stay in dialogue. You can email questions, reflections, ideas, and stories to storieslived.storiestold@gmail.com for a chance to be featured in an episode. You can comment on our Instagram at Stories Lived, Stories Told Pod, or the CMM Institute YouTube page to engage with other listeners. And you can subscribe to the CMM Institute Substack to make sure you're getting every episode right in your inbox. Links to all these places can be found in the show notes for this episode. Other ways you can support this podcast are by following, rating, and reviewing the show wherever you listen. Plus, please share this episode with someone you want to invite into the conversation. Stories Lived, Stories Told is an initiative of the CMM Institute for Personal and Social Evolution, an organization dedicated to furthering the coordinated management of meaning theory and practice of communication. More information about CMM can be found at cmminstitute.substack.com. Thank you for showing up. Thank you for being curious, and thank you for being a part of this story. I'm Abbie, and this has been Stories Lived, Stories Told.